The Hungaroring brought a wave of unexpected outcomes, from a surprise pole to a late race collapse, and a reigning world champion who was struggling to find his rhythm. This is a race where strategy reigned supreme, and the unexpected became the norm, culminating in a dramatic finish that reshaped the championship narrative, with the McLaren drivers continuing to face off in their title fight. All of this and more on this week's episode of the Grid Buzz podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grid Buzz podcast, where I will be deep diving into my race review of the Hungarian GP. This GP was a bit of a slow burner. This track is historically characterized as being hard to overtake, and outside of lap one, that definitely seemed to play out this year as well. But then things started to unravel a bit at the end of the GP, giving for some exciting racing as well as some championship implications, which we will get into later. But I will start out with my section on checkered flags and blue flags, so my biggest winners and losers of the Hungarian GP. And my biggest winner, my checkered flag of the race, has to be Lando Norris. Didn't start out too hot for him, qualifying P3. His teammate, who he's fighting for the World Drivers' Championship, qualifying P2. And then into turn one, as both of those drivers were battling, Norris gets caught a little bit out, maybe seemingly a little gentle on the brakes because he doesn't want to lock up or end up into his teammate on the first corner, first lap of the GP. And then that just opens the door for two people to overtake him through the next couple corners, putting him all the way back to P5. At this point in time in the race, it seemed like things had really sailed for Norris. Leclerc and Piastri were kind of walking away out front, and Piastri just looked a little bit quicker over the course of the weekend anyway. It did not look good for Norris. He did finally get past the two drivers that he needed to get past, but then he had to make up a lot of ground. He would have needed to catch up to Piastri. He would have needed to overtake on a track that's extremely hard to overtake. He also cooked his tires a little bit in that battle through the first couple laps, while Piastri seemingly dropped back from Leclerc, but that didn't seem to be a pace issue. It more just seemed like he was opening up a 3-second gap because he knew that he was, at the end of the day, battling with Norris and wanted to preserve his tires and knew that Norris would not have that luxury behind him. And that is where the strategy decisions started to divide. So Piastri and Leclerc going on the traditional two-stop, which was believed to be faster through this GP. Norris at that point in time really had nothing to lose, and so decided to gamble it on the one stop. Piastri was actually asked as well if he wanted a one stop, and he radioed back saying that he didn't think that that was going to be the optimal strategy. Norris, with nothing to lose, was just like, yeah, why don't we try it? We got nothing else to kind of lose here at this point. And that was the strategy call of the race. Panned out very well, put him up into P1. And although he looks to be struggling a little bit towards the end of the race, Piastri much quicker, there just wasn't enough of an offset for Piastri to make a move. And that put Norris P1, top step of the podium, and also helped him close the gap to his teammate in the World Drivers' Championship. So definitely my winner of the GP, which moves over into my first blue flag loser of the GP. And that, unfortunately, is Ferrari. In a weekend where I thought Leclerc was going to be a big winner, it's obviously looked pretty off the pace through most of the weekend, but Leclerc looked like he was going to be a big winner, and it just shifted towards the end of the GP. Everything unraveled, everything fell apart, and they unfortunately made it on my blue flag list. Leclerc reporting over the radio that there was, or alluding that there was some sort of change to his setup that they should have consulted him on, and that he did not want whatever this change was. He was audibly upset over the radio message. There was about 3 or 4 radio messages that came through where he kept repeating how hard the car was to drive, that he can't believe that they would do this, that they need to consult him on these things in the future. And to be honest, when he first started to report it, it didn't seem that bad. It still seemed like he had pace. But during that third stint, that second stint on the hards, the pace just fell off a cliff. I have no idea what happened, but Piastri was able to close a 4 or 5 second gap to Leclerc like nothing. And then on a track where overtaking is hard and the hard tires also on Leclerc's car were not even that old at that point, Piastri just zoomed right past him. And so I don't know what is going on. They kind of later reported that there was chassis issues. I don't know if I fully believe that. It seems like maybe that's a cover up to something else that happened that they just don't want the public or other teams to figure out. But pretty brutal. And then Russell also was able to put a pass on Leclerc. So he went from looking like P1 to not even on the podium, which was super unfortunate to see. And then Lewis was just absolutely nowhere on the weekend. Two bad weekends in a row on a track where Lewis has historically been very strong. And if Lewis was going to perform well anywhere, it seemed like it was going to be here, especially second weekend after the upgrades, being able to get those dialed in a little bit more. And that just did not play out. I believe this was Lewis Hamilton's worst qualifying on merit ever. He looked pretty defeated in the press conferences. So overall, pretty big loss for the weekend for Ferrari, which brings me over to my next checkered flag and winner, Aston Martin. So both drivers putting it in the points again. Alonso quite literally being the best of the rest at P5. Both of them being able to execute a great strategy and be able to prevent anybody from overtaking them. Alonso looked like he was battling with Bortoleto for a little bit, but was able to hold back his mentee. And so a double points finish for Aston Martin. Looks like those upgrades are working. They have correlated to the real world, and it will be interesting to see where Aston Martin continues to perform through the remainder of the season. And then that moves me over into my next blue flag loser, which is Red Bull. Really tough weekend for Red Bull. Yuki Tsunoda, nowhere again, but that's not all too different from most of the races as of recent. The flip side, though, is that this weekend, Max Verstappen also seemed to be nowhere. Now, he did seem like he had more pace than P9. Some bad strategy decisions were made, in my opinion, which we'll get into a little bit later. But overall, he was maybe P6, P5 at best, and ended up crossing the line P9, which for him is a pretty bad performance. And so Red Bull just not looking great right now, especially on the back of Max just confirming that he's keeping his contract. He'll stay through 2026. They're really going to have to kind of sort things out going into next year, or I would assume that he would be a risk to stay going into 2027. So super brutal weekend for Red Bull Racing, which moves me over into my next checkered flag winner, Gabriel Bortoleto. Amazing weekend for Bortoleto. That kick Sauber has come alive the last few races after upgrades. Hülkenberg's had some good races in the car. Bortoleto has had some good races in the car. Bortoleto had another good race this weekend, putting in not only his top qualifying position of his F1 career, but also his top finishing position. And at points of the race, looking like he had the pace for P5, but just with overtaking being so difficult here, not able to get it done. But a really impressive performance out of the rookie, who seems like he is on a upswing of form on the back of those upgrades. The car has, now that the car is behaving a bit better, it's allowing him to really kind of show his talent, which is great to see. And then that moves me over into my last blue flag loser of the weekend, and that is Pierre Gasly. Tough weekend for Gasly. I mean, that Alpine is not great, but it's actually less than great. It's probably the worst car in the grid right now. But Gasly has been known for being able to extract a little bit more out of that car than probably what that car is capable of or should be doing. And this weekend was not an instance of that. Pierre Gasly literally finishing as the back marker of the grid. On top of that, he got out-qualified and out-finished in the race by his rookie teammate, Colapinto. So good news for Colapinto because, he's on kind of a race-to-race contract, and Anytime he can beat his race winner teammate, that's advocacy for him staying on the team, but not great for Pierre Gasly this weekend. And that closes out my top winners and losers for the weekend, which moves me over into my next section. If the gap exists, top overtakes. And with that, Piastri v. Leclerc is my first top overtake to talk through. This was a very critical overtake, not just for the championship, but also to give Piastri even a chance to go fight Norris, because he had quite a bit of gap to go close down. It wasn't anything too exciting from an overtake perspective, but how quickly Piastri was able to just fly past Leclerc, not really seem to lose any time on that, on a track where overtaking is hard in general, was extremely important for him to give him a shot to go racing with Norris at the end, which ultimately gave us some good battles at the end as well. Piastri not able to get it done at the end of the day, but still a very critical overtake at a very critical time that opened the door for the potential. And even if he was not able to pass Norris and extend his gap in the World Drivers' Championship, he was at least able to minimize it a little bit by thrusting himself up into second place. And that brings me over into my next top overtake, which is Verstappen v. Hamilton. This is an interesting overtake. I wonder if there would have been points at stake here, if the outcome would have been a little bit different, but Verstappen deep send, very deep send into a high speed corner. Looked like he got his front axle maybe alongside the rear axle of Hamilton, but definitely not ahead of him at the apex, definitely not alongside of him. And he was just able to put himself enough there to kind of scare Hamilton. Hamilton ends up running wide off the track. Questionable overtake, but exciting and very brave to see Verstappen do that. Verstappen had a lot of honestly interesting overtakes, non-conventional overtakes during this GP, a few into the chicane. So he was really just kind of trying to catch people out and surprise them, which seemed to work in all instances, this one included. Although, like I said, maybe had the circumstances been a little bit different, that one wouldn't have slid, but it did at the end of the day. Helped him get up into P9, scoring, at least salvaging some points for Red Bull on an otherwise very difficult weekend. And then my last overtake to talk about is not an overtake, but it was a battle between Piastri and Norris, and it was exciting getting the kind of late race World Drivers' Championship implication battles in. And Piastri, once again, also similar theme to what if a few people had to do, or at least attempt to make overtakes this weekend, with a deep lunge on Norris into turn one with a lockup that almost resulted in them colliding with each other. The race engineer even came over the radio and had to remind Piastri how they go racing, alluding to don't hit your teammate. It gave similar vibes to an overtake that happened back, I think it was the Austrian GP. It was a few GPs ago where Piastri did the same thing and ended up locking up and almost slamming into Norris, and they actually had to call Piastri off and be like, hey, like, don't do this. Now, granted, that was at the beginning of the race, and they weren't as far out in the Constructors' Championship, so I don't think they were as comfortable with them fighting at that time. But yeah, Piastri has had a few instances of that this year, although he has not ended up into Norris, unlike the flip incident in Canada where Norris ended up into the back of Piastri. Fortunately, didn't hurt Piastri's race, did severely affect Lando Norris's race. But there were not too many overtakes to comment on, honestly, during this GP, which was what was expected to happen going into the weekend, which is unfortunate, but at least we did get a few. And so moving over into my next section, which is the steward's room, also not a lot of incidents to talk about. Really, the only incident that happened was the Hamilton v. Verstappen incident that ended up turning into a big nothing burger. Like I said, I think had Hamilton finished inside the points or had chance at the points, maybe this would have played out a little bit differently. I think had he protested it, Verstappen might have gotten some sort of 10-second penalty, 5-second penalty added on to the end of the race, or maybe even some super license points or some sort of penalty going into the race that will kick off at the end of the summer break. But because there wasn't really anything at stake, Hamilton just didn't even show up to the steward's room to advocate his case. And so the stewards looked at it and ultimately decided to drop it. So panned out well for Max Verstappen, but was a bit of a questionable overtake, although I did love to see it. It was exciting. It was brave. I'm glad that it happened, although it was questionable. And that really closes out our incidents of the Hungarian GP, which brings me over into the pit wall strategy, wins and blunders. So kind of similar theme of a lot of races, I feel like, this year, which is the drivers who pull the one stop are often touted as the winners. And this happened again during this GP. So we had this with Norris. We had this with the Aston Martin drivers. I honestly don't know why teams don't try the one stop more. It does obviously not work in certain instances, but it seems like it works more often than it doesn't. It seems like the tires hold up a lot better than they used to many years back. Pirelli has gotten that design, that construction to just be a lot more durable. You don't really see drivers blowing tires out from driving on them too long. Yeah, you do see some performance drop off. They always talk about the cliffs, but on a race like this where it's so hard to overtake, which you essentially saw with Norris and even the Aston Martins, just people weren't quick enough to get around them. I don't know why people don't try this more. I mean, we've seen Leclerc be successful with it in the past. We've seen Russell be successful with it in the past, even though he ended up not making weight and getting that win pulled away. We've seen Norris once again be successful during this race. So it kind of confuses me. Like I always want to see people go for the one stop. Honestly, before Norris even went for the one stop, I was really hoping that Leclerc was going to go for the one stop during this race. He's a driver who traditionally likes kind of going for the one stops. He suggests it a lot, even though the team overrides him oftentimes. Seemed like maybe they went a little risk off here because he was leading the GP and so wanted to go a more traditional route, which makes sense, but ended up not panning out. Now, at the same time, he's also pitted twice after that for hard tires. And on the second stint on hards, I'm still very confused on what was going on there, but he got just made mincemeat of. So had he been on older mediums or even older hards, I doubt he would have done any better. But car setup issues aside, I really would have liked to see the one stop happen. And then for my strategy blunders, the biggest strategy mistake, in my opinion, was Red Bull pitting Max Verstappen early. I understand that he couldn't get by and they wanted to pit him, get him on fresher tires, maybe undercut, give some offset. But that did not pan out at all because he ended up just pitting into midfield traffic and then ended up having to go and pass a bunch of people and be slowed down. And his times were actually off the people that he was up front with previous to that. So he was on fresher tires and losing time to them rather than undercutting them. And that is obviously never a good strategy, to be on fresher tires, burning through them, giving them now a tire offset because they will be on fresher tires later, and then also having them outpace you and you getting absolutely no undercut. It just seemed like, I mean, these race engineers have a lot of data. They're looking at a lot of things, but just pitting him into traffic like that seemed like a really bad idea. Now, on the flip side, it gave us some exciting overtakes because he was passing people left and right in unconventional areas. So that was exciting from a race perspective, but not a great strategy decision. And that brings me over into my final section on cockpit banter, top radio messages. And that obviously has to be Charles Leclerc's radio message back to Ferrari. He had a few of these during the race, but the one that I'm going to call out is the first one where he said, "This is so incredibly frustrating. We've lost all competitiveness. You just had to listen to me. I would have found a different way of managing these issues. Now it's undrivable. He was livid throughout the race, and I really wish that they came out with something other than it was chassis issues, because I feel like there was something else going on there, and it was just a big question mark as what that could have been, because obviously the car was already in Parc Ferme, and so they can't make a lot of changes at that point. So I'm really curious to know what sort of changes were made after that had happened that could have had such a big impact on the car's performance. And it's also really interesting that the car's performance was honestly pretty good in the first stint, and it seemed also fine in the second stint, but the third stint, it just fell off an absolute cliff. So I'm really confused and curious as to what that was. But Ferrari did, on the bright side, look like they had good pace on the week leading up into that. And so hopefully after the summer break, we will see more continuation of pace out of Ferrari. Hope to see them go fight more and that they learned from whatever it was that happened today. And that brings me to the end of my race review on the Hungarian GP. If you liked it, please give it a like, a subscribe, and stay tuned, as I will be releasing a number of special episodes during the summer break. So stay tuned for those, and I will talk to you all later.